Good morning from Washington, D.C., and good afternoon or good evening to the global DME for Peace community. Welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks, the best, most innovative, and greatest learning there is in the evaluation field. My name is Jennifer Howell, and I am the Senior Communications Associate for DME for Peace here at Search for Common Ground. And I'm currently in our DC headquarters, and I'll be taking over as moderator for this session. So today I'm delighted to welcome Scott Chaplowe, Director of EME Climate at the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. Many thanks for joining us today, Scott, and leading our discussion on top 10 tips for organizational M&E capacity development. And just as a note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A portion. I'll now hand over to today's guest. Scott, you're very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be contributing to the DME for Peace M&E Thursday Talks. As the slide, hopefully everyone's seeing, shows, I'm currently working with the Children's Investment Fund Foundation with a focus on their climate portfolio. Sometimes people ask why the focus on climate, and the explanation is primarily if you really care about the future of the children, climate is an important piece of that. So that's why it's part of the SIF's strategic objectives. Prior to that, I worked with the International Red Cross, Red Crescent for over a decade, which a global federation of over 190 national societies. So I got a lot of experience working with different size organizations there. And I've also worked with UN agencies, other types of civil society organizations, and I'm working now for a foundation, which is a particular organizational context as well. What I'm going to be talking about today is based on some research that I conducted with Brad Cousins for a book we came out in 2016 on SAGE, and also just my background supporting organizations and M&E capacity development in various contexts. I first presented this in 2017 as an expert lecture at the AEA, the American Evaluation Association's International Conference, and have since incorporated it into a lot of the professional development trainings and such that I'll do. What I feel is a key part of an M&E professional's responsibility isn't just so much to practice M&E him or herself, but to help others who are not M&E specialists understand, use, and support M&E for learning, decision-making, and accountability. So that's where a lot of this is coming from. Before I start, I want to just kind of revisit semantics. And in the M&E industry, there are a lot, this is just a very purposeful sample of different acronyms used for what we can call monitoring and evaluation. And I think it's important to understand that whereas M&E has a very specific technical evaluation, monitoring, typically ongoing tracking, regular day-to-day achievements, and then whereas evaluation is more sporadic and stepping back and valuing the judgment or merit in something. M&E actually is broader than that in practice, and it involves a lot of other practices and processes that M&E practitioners often support, such as information generation. A lot of the data collection might not just be used for monitoring and evaluation, but at the initial assessment to determine what, if, and what should be done, baseline inline surveys and such. And then as well as information management and the system to manage the information after it's been gathered or generated, and then the use of the information. I'll be approaching M&E as a term is a more broader umbrella catchphrase for a lot of processes that M&E people often get involved with. So without any further ado, I will start off with my first tip, and I would venture to say the most important tip, because I think it kind of sets the tone for the tips to follow, and that's pretty much adopt a systems approach. By that I mean an approach that encompasses a more holistic view of the context that you're trying to deliver organizational development. It's important to keep that forest in view rather than just zooming in on one tree, particularly if there might be a forest fire or something that can burn down the whole forest. So I think it's the larger context in which we pursue M&E capacity development is really important. And as a system, it's going to be comprised of different parts. And I think one of the things is the here is for evaluation capacity building, which you can just juxtapose with evaluation capacity development. A lot of people who are steeped in the industry or the academia of it all will get into debates about the difference between ECB and ECD, but for our purposes, they're more or less trying to build the capacity again for that information generation, management, and use. And this is a very influential quote from early in 2000s that kind of laid some of the groundwork or encapsulated a lot of the thinking on it at the time. And one of the things that I like to point out as a context-dependent phenomenon is you don't want to silo your efforts in M&E capacity development. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but M&E is embedded in the system, and the system's perspective helps us to understand the interrelated dynamics, the different factors and actors, and how they can support M&E capacity development, but also hinder M&E capacity development. And one of the most common conceptual frameworks that can be used to look at M&E capacity development, for that matter, just capacity development in the international development or humanitarian response context, is what's showing here. And there are several authors that have used this in books or reports to convey different levels within a system. From the individual learner or actor to the organization, and then to the external environment, which is often where the mission of the organization lays. What kind of change and condition are they seeking to achieve? And when you're looking at monitoring and evaluation, it's important to think about both the supply, what's the existing human, financial, and physical capital for monitoring and evaluation, and also the demand, and that's, what are the incentives or motivations to use skilled personnel to deliver on M&E or to engage people in an organization. And I'll talk about why this is important a bit later when we look at training transfer. But this micro, meso, and macro levels approach here is a very useful way of looking at a lot of different interventions that we try to roll out. At the organizational level, organizations often have just like individuals, a pretty unique personality. And it will be based on the history, the traditions, the culture that it's in. Is it in Singapore, or is it in Nairobi, or is it in Haiti? And the mission, of course, of the organization, the leadership tone. Leadership has a huge influence, the management style, and any opportunities, incentives, and rewards that the organization might have for capacity development. So it's an important thing to be thinking about at the organizational level. And at the end, and also on the beginning slide, I have a link to a website that I've developed that has some resource pages. And one of them is a questionnaire when you're approaching an organization to ask why do they think they need to develop their M&E capacity. And it's very interesting to take a look at that. Oftentimes it can be imposed from the top. Other times it can be incentivized, or the motivation can be coming from the program and project teams themselves, and everything in between. So it's an important consideration. This is another diagram of the different conceptual factors that can affect M&E and its capacity development. And the two quotes there reflect that basically M&E doesn't happen in a political, economic, or cultural vacuum. There are a lot of things that can affect it. For example, a lot of us work in international development, and for evaluation, the DAC criteria have floated to the top as some of the most important evaluation criteria. But they're being contested right now, and they're being revisited. And even when they first came out, LNAP kind of came out with an additional criteria to be included with them that DAC adapted because evaluation, and the evaluation particularly of sustainability in a humanitarian context can be very different from a development context. So that would be an example of an external factor, maybe the demand, or I'm having this blocked on my screen here. Yeah, the regulatory context that might fall underneath that as an example. And it's important to remember that enabling can be sound policies or enabling factors, high commitment, effective coordination, stable economic environment. Disabling factors that can hinder M&E capacity development could be economic and civil instability, particularly in areas where there's conflict, and I think that's relevant for this community. Poor policies, high levels of corruption. These are all things, policies, laws, accountability standards, funding priorities, the different actors in the society that can be drawn upon are the universities around that might be able to be part of any capacity building efforts, and so forth. There are also practical considerations like the public infrastructure, if you're thinking about doing an online type of intervention, or facilities and transportation if it's going to be face-to-face. This is an interesting diagram here, and one of the reasons I like to show it at this point in the presentation is not just because it shows a kind of more systemic approach to M&E capacity development, but it's actually from a terrific resource which you can freely download off the internet from the World Bank. And these slides will be available at the end, but you can see the title is Making Monitoring Evaluation Systems Work, a Capacity Development Toolkit. And I think the diagram kind of speaks for itself. There's a lot of different ways to cut the pie and to visualize interrelationships between different considerations for capacity development intervention, and it will be circumstantial, but I thought this was just an interesting example to share with you. So I spent a lot of time on the first principle, or first tip, because I think it is very important. But in a way, coupled with a systems approach, is to be systematic at the same time. And by being systematic, it is an intentional activity. You're making it, there is incidental learning, by the way, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly, but a capacity development intervention for M&E or anything is intentional. And it should be systematically planned and delivered, but it doesn't mean that it needs to be a rigid blueprint that's blindly followed. I think a lot of people who are listening to this might have been trainers or facilitators in their lives, and sometimes during a workshop, based on the type of questions you get and the participant engagement, you might decide to veer from your agenda to best meet their learning needs. And the same can work for an organization as a whole. And I think this is becoming more commonplace in the development industry with greater recognition of adaptive management and strategy testing and testing theories of change and such. So a plan shouldn't inhibit experimentation and the ability to adapt and respond to changing needs, unexpected outcomes, or whatever it may be. And we just need to recognize that organizations are very dynamic. For example, I'm working on climate change, and the funding that our organization has been handling has increased drastically with the need for climate change. But other factors like the election of Donald Trump as the US president, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or other global outcomes have also affected our work as well in our organization. Okay, and the little cartoon down there on the right is just to remind people, don't get set in doing it in one way, but think outside the box, test your theories of change. Another thing that's really important for our M&E capacity development is to plan and deliver it in a way with attention to transfer. And by transfer, I mean, often in training, it's called training transfer. And that's the ability of trainees to put to practice what they learned. And that's harder to measure. And I've seen a lot of times a M&E capacity building solution is to build the capacity of the organization's staff because there's a gap in performance in a certain area. And if you do a proper causal analysis, sometimes you might find that the problem isn't a low capacity. The problem might be low motivation, or oftentimes people might take training, but senior leadership doesn't really allow the space for them to practice what they've been trained in. So that's part of taking a look at the organization and any intervention for capacity development holistically. Any capacity development makes a difference when it's useful and used, and it shouldn't just be something for itself. And with that in mind, a key consideration, which I mentioned earlier, is to identify key individuals or gatekeepers who can support or who might undermine a capacity development. Leaders can be great natural champions, but one of the things that's important to understand about M&E is there's often resistance to, not often, yes, statistically the studies show that there's a high trend of resistance to monitoring and evaluation being done or the capacity rolled out in an organization because a lot of people see it as bureaucratic or policing, or their resistance to being having performance assessed. So the adversary, if you want to call it that can undermine M&E should be carefully navigated as well, not just the champion. The fourth tip, moving along here, is to meaningfully engage stakeholders in the capacity development process. Now, I don't think this is going to be that original to a lot of people in the development or humanitarian industry. In fact, if you pick up most books on evaluation, usually in the first 5 chapters, there's going to be one there on engaging or participation or stakeholders. Ideally, we can go beyond consultation, and particularly in the organizational context. If we're going to, we need to build the demand for M&E so it can be owned and supported. So it's best that the capacity development is done with rather than to the organizations. And again, this will involve inviting the right people to sit down at the table to plan for it. It's more than just a consultation, but an opportunity for people to provide input, to become involved in various aspects. It ultimately will engage key stakeholders, learning, understanding, and ownership of whatever's planned to delivered on for M&E capacity development. The fifth tip that I want to talk about is to align and pursue M&E capacity development with other organizational objectives. So what I have here is showing for for M&E, some things you might want to consider within the larger organization. One of those is that M&E is one area that contributes to the mission of an organization. And there are multiple other areas, from the performance of an HR department to finance to the actual individual program teams, whether it's child health or safety or climate change or shelters or water sanitation. And it's important not to silo M&E capacity development. I remember after some large-scale disasters, all the different aid and development organizations would fly in to Haiti or Colombo or the various areas that the disaster was at. And each organization, not each, but a lot of the organizations wanted to give their own training or their own, like I worked with the International Red Cross, Red Crescent, so the national society in the country that that was responding to the disaster, in the case, for example, Sri Lanka, to the tsunami, all the different national societies coming from the United States, Britain, Japan, where have you, all wanted the national society to take their special training. And what you had is a training overload. And I think this is also true in organizations. There's a tendency to top list your field of focus. And I would recommend seeing what existing trainings there are. Is there a program management training? And shouldn't M&E be part of program management? Because any good program manager or project manager should be able to identify what they want to achieve and to be able to track it and determine whether or not they are achieving it or making a difference. So it's important to consider the degree to which the M&E capacity development intervention will complement or duplicate or at times even compete with other existing capacity development initiatives in the organization. The sixth one is basically, make sure it's fit for purpose. You might not need a Maserati to get around the block if a good Volkswagen that starts up, is filled up with gas, the seat belts work, can do the job. You need to consider that the coverage or reach. Are we talking about an organization with 50 people, 500 people, or 5,000 people? What human resources are available? And of course, financial, material resources, and also the time frame. Are we talking about building up capacity over 2 years or over 2 weeks or over 2 days or over 2 hours? Right now, we're doing it in about an hour from a webinar. But this could be packaged as part of a larger program. Yeah, I think that's self-explanatory. Another consideration is to capitalize on existing M&E capacity development mediums and outlets and such. You want to utilize and complement and reinforce these where they exist. We have different learning styles. Some people are more independent learners. Some people learn better online. Some people need the encouragement of being in a group face-to-face. There's face-to-face delivery. There's webinars like the one we've got now, self-directed learning, communities of practice, discussion boards, listservs. What you need to be thinking about is as the slide shows, there are many different options. Do you want to adopt one, adapt one, or develop one yourself, or combine them, which is often called a blended approach to capacity development? There might be some live engagement, and they're complemented by some online or reading engagement. And of course, if you can capitalize on existing resources, it will save time and money, just like secondary data for a survey, but you need to make sure it's relevant and the resources are good. This is the diagram that I was talking about before. When we look at, this is a study that was conducted, let me see when the dates are. in there. No, I don't, but the resource and the link is there. And it just gets across the message that a lot of learning is actually incidental through direct experience and not necessarily through that which is like a training. So I like to share that with people because I think it's a interesting. I haven't looked at the methodology of the study, but it's an interesting visual snapshot and reminder. Okay, the third to last is basically is looking at how adults learn, and this is one of the emphasis for the book that I co-authored with Brad. Is we were finding a lot of resources out there to help people build the capacity specific to a specific organization, or just resources out there and training in general, not M&E. But we weren't really finding anything specific to training other people in M&E in a more generic sense. Of course, in academia, you get a bit of that. But what we concluded was others felt the same way. We did identify 14 key principles in our chapter on adult learning. And it's basically premised on the idea that adults are self-directed learners that bring to training past experiences, values, opinions, expectations, priorities that shape why and how they learn. It's not like a 9-year-old in a school that is there because he or she needs to be there. Adults are often paying for the training or for the learning, or their organization is sending them to it. And the principles for adult learning should therefore have a more learner-centered approach that's applied, experimental, participatory, and builds upon prior experience. 9, I think 9 is something that we can all relate to. There are a lot of professional standards and principles and ethics in the work that we do. I could include another bucket of standards. We got one for evaluation or M&E and another one for just training in general. It's kind of US centric because that's where I first gave this presentation. I haven't had a chance to update it, but another bucket of standards and principles would be those of working in humanitarian contexts, whether it be with children or vulnerable populations, and also in the collection of the data, SAD, getting sex and age and disability aggregated data. So there's quite a lot of different standards that would need to be looked at according to the context. And trying to stay on time and keep this within the half hour. The last one is basically to walk our talk. And if you're coming up with a organizational capacity development initiative, and remember, it doesn't just have to be training, whether it be online or offline. It can be exchange visits, internships, mentorships. It can be built in with the HR program of the organization, whatever. Build in feedback loops to come back and look at how well it is working. It's very important to do. And I guess the last thing is the post hoc tip is always have disclaimers for the top 10 list. So if some of you guys start attacking my top 10 list, I'm sure I can find an excuse for why it's on there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Scott, for that. That was really insightful, and I'm looking forward to our Q&A coming up. So we will now open up today's presentation for our questions. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday Talks. You can submit a question in 2 ways. The first is through the question function. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, which will allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you submit your question, we will ask that you submit your name and affiliation. And just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace, so that those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and discussion. So we already have a few questions rolling in. While everyone is sending in their questions, I'm going to use my moderator's privilege to start us off by asking a question from Jack Farrell, who you might know as our DME for Peace project manager. So here we go. Jack asks, well, he says, thanks for the great presentation, Scott. Building on your point about engaging different stakeholders, do you have tips or methods that you use to get stakeholder buy-in to M&E processes, such as co-designed indicators, etc.?
Yeah, I do. I think it's going to depend on the context. So the first tip is in what we lay out, or what I lay out generally when I'm looking at it more formally, is similar to a project cycle. The first thing you want to do is an initial assessment. And to what degree can you reach and access and involve different stakeholders during the planning stage? And then based on that, you can kind of navigate when and how to engage them moving forward. And one of the things that we outline in the book that I have, which is it looks at the big picture of organizational capacity development, but then it kind of zooms into face-to-face training. And we kind of cover 99 activities to make learning a bit more fun for people. For example, we might explain what a smart indicator is and then put up on a flip chart some dumb indicators, or give a flip chart with a dumb indicator purposely written down for different breakout groups. And they got to come back with it written smarter. And we use that as a teaching tool. We could even make a game out of it and have a judge judging them like a diver, 1 through 10, with 10 being the best score. And then we have them write down indicators from their own programs or projects, and then we can critique them. So it can be more of an applied training as well. But one of the things to remember about indicators is one of the first things I like to point out to people. We can practice designing them because it's good for learning, but ideally the first choice is to see if there's an industry recognized indicator that's already out there. And what that means is that there's already people who have spent time and defined it out, and it allows comparability across time, place, and measure. But I hope that answers your question. If not, elaborate, and I can maybe answer a bit more.
All right, thank you, Scott. We have a question. Actually, Farah and Karim has raised their hand and also sent in the question. So I'm going to unmute you, Farah, and if you would like to ask yourself, please feel free. Hi, Farah, you're unmuted.
Yes, this is Farhan from American Red Cross, working at Cox's Bazar in camp settlements. Actually, I am working on a monitoring, evaluation, learning officer. I want to just know, like, when you are working at complex emergency ground, where situation is always changing, your stakeholders, your beneficiaries, government system, everything is changing frequently. At that situation, how can I move for appropriate result-based monitoring, where we are still facing problem in process monitoring of our activities?
Right. Well, I think that's an example of something where it's a combination of maybe capacity development, but also taking a look at the systems and protocols. And by the way, I used to work with American Red Cross once upon a time during the tsunami. And one of the things that I think is really important is we often get frameworks, whether it's a logic model, outcome mapping, results framework, what may be done as an annex in a proposal, as sadly to say, sometimes it's like an afterthought right before the proposal's due. And or even if a lot of time is put into it, it's really limited to a sound identification of the intended results and the indicators that will be used to measure that. But what's often missing is what you can call an M&E plan or framework, which actually goes beyond just the results and the indicators, but also identifies how you're going to operationalize that framework, how are you actually going to measure on it, and who's responsible for doing that. And what is the frequency of doing? Is it something that needs to be reported on a quarterly basis, or is it just more baseline, end line, beginning and end of a program or project? Or is it something that be recorded on a weekly or monthly basis? For example, a lot of the security monitoring that has to happen in a conflict area needs to be monitored 24/24. So it will vary according to context. And then based on that, these tables, M&E plans, M&E frameworks, the format of them can vary based on what's going to be useful for what you need to achieve. So if you have the engagement of different partner groups that you might want to target for capacity development, there might be internally displaced people, for example, that you might want to have engaged because they might be able to, or for whatever reasons, it might add something to their experience that's positive, give them something to do, or be more accurate in the information that you're getting. The listening projects, for example, has done a bit of that. Whatever the stakeholder group, you can note that in that plan, so you're at least thinking ahead. And yeah, you're going to have to pivot and adopt based on how things move. And that's where the ongoing monitoring, evaluation, and feedback loops are really important, so you can read those changes readily. One of the things I do in the responsibilities line, or the column, or the column that's going to have the target audience or stakeholder group, is identify, if it's an individual, identify not just their individual name, but the job title. So in case that individual shifts out, you will know what the job title is, and you can go find the new person that's been assigned to that. I don't know if that helps Farham, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Scott. I have a question that's come in asking, Scott, do you have any advice or tips for building evaluation capacity when the, quote, adversary to the process claims that M&E is too Western?
Yeah, I mean, there's, if you're on listservs, it's pretty funny. Sometimes the people that are most critical of M&E being too Western are people from the West, and somebody from Bangladesh will send in a discussion thread or a post onto a discussion thread saying, well, actually, I like logical frameworks. I think they work really well. But if you do have senior leadership or individuals that are resistant to M&E for whatever reasons, because it's culturally imperialistic, because it's linear and hierarchical, because they're resistant or have territorialism to who's going to be doing what or how things are going to be perceived. I think the first thing to do is to try to listen to that person and acknowledge what's right. For example, you could acknowledge that, yes, it came from the West. To be specific, the logical framework came from a consulting agency working with USAID in the early 70s. So you can Wikipedia. And you can also point out that it's the most widely adopted framework that's used, at least a 4x4 results framework, logic model, log frame, but there might be another framework that they're using. There's a lot of, and and you can acknowledge the limitations, and but also acknowledge that if you're going to get beyond that those limitations, it's good to have an understanding of what they are first. And I often use metaphors to explain that. So one metaphor I'd say is, if I'm in a room standing up, I'll point to one corner far from where I am. And I say, if I want to go from point A to B, where I am now and where I want to go, and I hire you as a consultant to do that for me, I want a plan. I don't want just a postmodern, post-relativist, lackadaisical, hey man, it's going to depend on which way the wind's blowing. I want a plan, and then we will go that way. But if in getting to point B in the city, there's a traffic jam, or there's a parade, or there's a flood, or for whatever reason we need to change our course, we want to be able to do that. We want to have a system to monitor that kind of stuff. So that's one of the ways I get around the hierarchical approach And there's a lot of increasing literature and attention out there on adaptive management. So I think that can help potentially with that. There could be other solutions too, like if you're doing a theory of change, not calling a theory of change, but calling it, a map, and let them start creating that map. In fact, sometimes it's good, rather than being hierarchical, put what they relate to right in the middle, their tribe, if you want to call it that, and then build factors and actors around it that can support or undermine what they want to do around it consensually. I found that has worked well too.
Great, thank you, Scott. We have what could potentially be our last question. I do want to say that I have talked to Scott beforehand, and he is very interested and happy to answer any questions that we don't get to, because we do have quite a long list of really great and insightful questions for Scott still to answer, and it's information that we do want to get out there. So if you have not had your question answered, or you still have one but you're afraid we're going to run out, feel free to send them in still. And when you access the recording for this, which we will let you know through social media and our upcoming emails, you will see that the questions will also be answered on that page. So having said that, for what could possibly be our last question, we have Cecilia Deme. Cecilia asks, well, first she says, thank you, Scott. Very interesting and informative. One question about what do you think about digitalizing the M&E field? Cecilia says, I feel that because of digital technology, practitioners in the field start missing the point. Everything is about mobile phones, tablets, and software. Very little about people and causes. Cecilia is an independent consultant with multiple years of experience in the field, and please take it away, Scott.
Well, I think it's a great question. I think you've answered it for me. I mean, the technology is the metaphor that I use is the technology is the table that you serve it on, but you still have to cook it up in the kitchen. So for a lot of information management systems, which I do think is an important topic, because I find a lot of organizations struggle with that. They can track the activities and stuff, but the outputs into the outcomes, the missing middle, often gets lost, and oftentimes because there's not a coherent information management system to roll up from projects to programs to country level or regional level and up to global level. So I do think it's really important to take a look at that. But any information management system's gonna generally start off with an Excel spreadsheet, where you identify in your Excel spreadsheet, what you're going to be measuring, your actuals, your targets, your percentage of target of variance, and so forth and so on. So I think it's very important that I agree with, I guess Cecilia, completely agree with you. They got to be thinking about the meat in the sandwich, if you want to call it that, or tofu to be politically correct, and not just the bread on the sides or the table that it's going to be served on. One thing I would advise is I would veer away, and this isn't categorical, but I just caution against having something specifically designed just for your organization, because I've seen organizations do that before, and then down the road 4 or 5 years when they want to update it or whatever, it becomes a nightmare, and particularly if it doesn't really talk to other systems that are out there. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that. So unfortunately, I will have to be wrapping things up for us. I want to say again a special thank you to Scott Chaplowe, and a thank you to everyone for joining this edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. As I stated before, this recording will be posted online on the M&E Thursday Talk discussion page later today, so that you are able to return to it and share it with your colleagues. I will also be collecting the questions that haven't been answered, and I will be sending them to Scott, and he'll get back to me with, I'm sure, very insightful answers, and I, at that point, will post them up on the page as well, so please keep checking back. We'll also be putting the PDF of the presentation with the recording, so you'll be able to easily reference the numerous resources that Scott highlighted during his presentation. Also, please feel free to continue the discussion online in the comment sections. So as for our next and last M&E Thursday Talk of 2019, we'll be back next Thursday, December 19th, where we will be talking with Khalil Bitar of Eval Youth Global Networks and Eval MENA, exploring the question, evaluators as activists, the role of evaluators in protecting and promoting social justice and equality. You can register now on our website for that Thursday talk and continue to look for updates on our social media. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your work weeks. And I look forward to hearing from you next time. And thanks again, Scott.
Bye-bye.